Welcome back to Relaunch Greater Lansing's Trusted Voices interview series. I'm Mark Bashore. We are talking with leaders in healthcare, business, education, and government about the importance of getting COVID vaccinations. Our special guest today, Dr. Peter Graham, Chief Medical Officer at Physicians Health Plan. Dr. Graham, many thanks for joining us in this important communications effort.
Thank you, Mark.
There's continues to be just an ongoing extended conversation about the safety of the various COVID vaccines. Broadly, what's your view of the safety issue of the vaccine?
Based on the data we have, they're exceedingly safe. The track record over the last couple months, and understand within the last 2-3 months, both in the United States and abroad, we've vaccinated literally tens of millions, now verging on close to 100 million human beings across the planet, and have a lot of safety data on this. In fact, a lot more than we have on a lot of vaccines that have been around a lot longer. And so far, very, very little evidence of any real risk. Understand anytime you do a medical procedure on somebody, irrespective of what it is, and that includes any kind of medication, there always is a little bit of risk. But so far, we've seen very little. This is a very safe series of vaccines, irrespective of which one you choose.
Clinical trials have shown different efficacy rates for different vaccines. Also, some vaccines require 2 doses, not just 1. How do you advise patients process that information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess the best way I'd start to answer that is that my colleagues in infectious disease, who are normally pretty persnickety and data-driven people, they will tell you the best vaccine to get is the one you can get the soonest. And shorthand way of saying that all 3 of the major ones that are available in the United States, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, roughly equivalent in terms of actual outcomes that matter. And some of this is kind of distinction with differences and distinctions that don't have a difference. If you look at the percentage efficacy rates, they're really looking at kind of not quite apples to apples statistical models. If you look at the outcomes that really matter to most people, as in, are you going to get sick enough to be in the hospital, or are you going to die from COVID? They're all about equally effective and in the high 90s, like the 97 to 99% range. Which is astonishing. That's way better than any of us expected. So in terms of trying to kind of comparison shop or wait and see what you can get, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to worry about that in terms of efficacy. Now, I would say in terms of ease, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine being a single dose series is a lot easier for a lot of people. Logistically, it's easier to get one shot instead of 2. And not having to time them and take the additional time out of life and work and everything else. And for people who have a hard time with that, the J&J vaccine is a really great option for that reason. But in terms of efficacy, they're all about equally effective.
Can you speak to the difference between FDA authorized and FDA approved? Also, if you could touch on what this emergency use authorization refers to, and how is this different than receiving FDA approval or FDA authorization?
Yeah, that's an excellent question too. And I know it's created a little bit of confusion. Typically, the FDA approval process, and understand that vaccines go through the same type of approval process that all other pharmaceuticals do. It requires a pretty exhaustive series of steps that any manufacturer has to go through to prove really 2 things. One, that a drug or therapy is effective. That is, does it actually treat the thing that it's designed to treat? And 2, is it safe? And they use a set of endpoints for that, and kind of goes through, starting with kind of lab animal models all the way through small clinical trials, all the way to large clinical trials, and then out the other end. So it's kind of easier to start with what does FDA approval really mean, or what does FDA authorization mean? That's typically what it means. And that does, kind of tip to tail design process usually takes anywhere from 18 months to a couple of years, depending on what the drug is. Depends on how many people have the condition that you're trying to treat, or how many folks can be in the sample populations. And it just takes a certain amount of time. You have to give people a drug, see if it works, see if they have side effects, and go from there. An emergency use authorization, which is what we're working under for the current COVID vaccinations, EUA recognizes that occasionally you'll have an event like we're in right now, once in a century pandemic where you have a potentially deadly virus, easily spread, very contagious, very widespread. And there the balance of risk and benefit really weigh on the side of it's of more benefit to get people the drug or the treatment or the vaccine sooner rather than later. We're willing to accept a little bit of risk earlier on, and we'll grant or we'll allow the FDA to grant basically a foreshortened process to authorization. What I think that gets mistranslated to in some folks' understanding is that means there was no testing and that everybody's essentially a lab rat. Nothing could be further from the truth. They spent a ton of time. And a lot of people, probably most of us know, or at least are kind of 1 degree of separation away from somebody or friend and neighbor or family member who was in the clinical trials for these vaccines as they developed them late in 2020 or kind of middle of 2020 and through the end part of the year. So they have gone through a kind of abbreviated version of the approval process that we would typically see. Also, as part of an EUA, you typically, and this is true of FDA authorization overall, there's always a safety monitoring mechanism in place afterwards. And the issues that did crop up, for example, the J&J vaccine a couple of weeks ago, we saw that there was a temporary pause in J&J. That was part of the vaccine monitoring, that they noticed that there were certain complications that seemed to be a little more common than they would expect in an average population, picked them up, ran through them. I think for most people's understanding, or for most people's level of comfort, I would say an EUA doesn't really signify anything other than just the need to get the vaccine out was outweighing the need to be this degree of certain. Probably something that most people in this set of audiences, business people, will probably resonate with. It would be sort of like the difference between going for 4 sigma versus 6 sigma. Typically the FDA looks for 6 sigma. In this particular instance, they're willing to settle for 4 sigma. Still really high reliability, but not high reliability, if that makes any sense. That's kind of the difference between the two.
Very interesting way to put it. Let's assume a patient of yours comes to you and says, Dr. Graham, I'm afraid that getting the vaccine will give me COVID-19. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a great, it sounds like you've been in my exam room once or twice, because I've had that question. And to be fair, I've had this question about other vaccines over the years. I know that's something that tends to cause concern for people, particularly around influenza vaccine. That was a common one. Pretty much everybody has a story about, I got the flu from the flu shot once, which is an impossibility. Same story with the COVID vaccines. They don't contain live virus. They don't contain an entire viral particle. So there's literally no way it can give you COVID. Zero. It's just not possible. And I know there's been some concern of late, particularly about a phenomenon known as viral shedding. That is when folks are not symptomatic but are producing virus. And this has happened in the past with some other types of vaccines, that people are at risk of spreading it to other folks. It's absolutely impossible with the vaccines that are currently available.
Can the vaccine alter one's DNA?
No, that's another common misconception, particularly with the Pfizer Moderna vaccines. They do use an mRNA model. And if I could clear up something on that one too, as long as you kind of open the door. I know there's concern that it was a novel technology. Actually, mRNA technology has been around for a while. It just hasn't been used in this widespread basis. It's probably good 10, 15 years old. Just really hasn't been need for it to this point. It does use some of the mechanisms of our own cells to create, typically what you do with a vaccine is you try to expose your immune system to some part of something that you want it to react to. And usually the worst parts of vaccines are from that, kind of broad immunogenicity of whatever it is you're injecting. It tends to make people feel pretty awful. mRNA vaccine lets you kind of target in on what is that specific thing that you want your immune system to respond to, gets your own cells to manufacture some of that and respond to it. So it's kind of a distinction with an important difference, but no, it does not graft itself into your DNA. So far, I have not, I'm fully vaccinated. I have yet to wake up with X-ray vision or power of flight or anything else, more's the pity.
A two-part question next. How does the vaccine impact the COVID variants that have been reported? Also, there have been reports that booster shots might eventually be needed. Could you address both of those, please?
Yeah, that excellent questions as well. I'm glad you brought them up together because the two are inextricably linked. I'll start with the good news, which is that so far, and I'm knocking wood here, even though you can't see it off camera, so far the major variants that we've seen remain susceptible to the vaccines, which is good. The worry is the more, and this, if we can all harken back to high school or college biology, the more something reproduces, the greater the opportunity that there will be a mutation, we'll get a version of it that isn't the same. And viruses, if you think about it, are tiny little things in your body. When you're infected, produces literally millions of them, if not trillions, over a period of an infection. And you multiply that out over, millions of human beings across the planet who either have had or are currently infected with COVID, you get a whole lot of opportunities for error there. So the more people get sick and the more virus is multiplying, the greater the risk that a variant will emerge that we won't be able to contain or control with the current versions of the vaccines that are available. So kind of a long-winded way of saying that's part of the reason we really, those of us in the healthcare field, really want as many people who can get vaccinated to do it, and as soon as possible. The less viral reproduction you have going on, the better off we all are collectively. It's not about you, it's about us, everybody. The booster question is related to that, and the question is, will we need a booster? Yes, no. There are two parts to that. One is, do we retain the ability to produce the antibodies? Our own immune system, can it produce the antibodies it needs to resist an infection? That is one of the shortcomings of an EUA in a kind of foreshortened period. The longest at this point anybody has had any of the major vaccines in their system is just shy of a year. We're kind of coming up on it. So far, it looks not bad, the type of immune response that people are retaining, but we don't really know until we see after exposure. That's part of the reason you like to see this in a population and not just in a lab or a test tube, because humans are pretty complex critters. So it's entirely possible that immunity fades enough over a period of time that we would need to do that. The other possibility, I think this is why I link it to the, why kind of try to clamp it down as best we can, is if a variant emerges that is not susceptible to current vaccines, we would probably need to be reboosted with a version that was specific to those strains. That's kind of what happens with flu vaccine now. That's why we have to do an annual flu shot, because influenza mutates pretty much every year, mutates very rapidly. And your body just doesn't either recognize it, know how to fight it, or doesn't remember. So you have to kind of give it a goose every once in a while. We may end up needing to do that with COVID. If I were a betting person, I would say there's a pretty good chance we are probably going to need it. This is going to become what's called an endemic virus. I don't think we're going to eradicate it completely. I think it's going to be around, and I suspect we're going to need to get boosted, all of us, at some point. I don't know whether this becomes an annual or not.
Well, we've been joined today by Dr. Peter Graham, Chief Medical Officer at Physicians Health Plan. Dr. Graham, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure.